Welcome everyone to our session tonight with Paula Allen, where we're going to focus on some macro investment themes, and we're also going to talk a little bit about careers later on and some advice in relation to your studies and the choices that you might make as an early graduate in your career. So plenty to look forward to. Just as some background, so the Melbourne Investing Club is something that I started with Sergio, who's on the call tonight, a few years ago, mainly during COVID, really, and it was a way for, I guess, people who are interested in investing to stay in touch over those tough years in Melbourne, especially.
Yeah, good idea.
And we used to catch up every Saturday afternoon, and then after COVID, once people could do things again, we've sort of fiddled around with the timings a wee bit. But it's been a very worthwhile thing, and we've got over 150 members now, so it's great.
That's a lot. Good on you.
Yeah. So
I was in a wine club and a Krav Maga club, so I'm not sure if that was quite comparable to investing. So good on you. That was very well done.
So yeah, look, tonight we're very honoured to have Paula Allen here. Now, Paula is someone who might be known to many of you through the CFA Society. She's on the National Council for Advocacy, I believe, for the Chartered Financial Analyst Societies of Australia.
I also do the nominations, and I'm on the Global Disciplinary Board.
Excellent. Wow, it's I wasn't aware of that global disciplinary board.
Well, the good news is I'll never have to see any of you because I'd be conflicted, I dare say. So that will be, hopefully I never see you anyway, but.
Now, look, as we're going to cover tonight, Paula's got over 25 years experience in executive roles and director level roles, right up through to today. She's got experience across a really broad range of sectors, in particular, technology and digital assets and things, but also superannuation, finance, wealth, and the services sector as well. And I think one of the beautiful things I can see about your career, Paula, is that you've really picked and chosen the sort of things that you want to do, and you've been very, to my mind anyway, you've been very conscious about what you've done in your career. So it'll be really good to hear a bit more about how you've planned that tonight. I think Paula is known as a leader, certainly in business and in the CFA Society, as being very values-based, as being very engaged and brings a lot of enthusiasm to everything she does. And I think that's really shown out by the number of speaking invites you get to all manner of investment conferences. So it's a real honour to have you here tonight, Paula.
Thank you, James. It's very kind of you.
Okay, now just before we get going, I know I've provided Paula a couple of questions, but we'll just start with a couple of quick fire ones that she hasn't seen to get you going, Paula. So we'll start with a tough one. If you were 25, Paula, and you had to live in any city in the world to start your career, which would it be?
Austin.
Austin, Texas. And any particular reason?
Boston, Massachusetts.
Boston, Massachusetts. Different.
Any particular reason? Great city, lot of fun, lot of history, and big enough to be able to do some fun work.
Okay. Next one, Paula. What's your favourite holiday destination in Australia?
Oh, in Australia. I had the answer before you finished the question, and then the question turned out differently. In Australia, Tasmania.
Okay. Good wine?
Good wine, Shiraz.
Yeah.
Anything that I'm scared I'm going to wake up in the morning and it puts hairs on my chest.
Okay.
I haven't had hairs on my chest.
Okay. Internationally, favourite holiday destination?
New Zealand, South Island.
Very good. Yeah, you can't go. TR now?
Yeah.
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
I've been there. I think I'll take time now.
Absolutely beautiful. Okay, and last one, Paula. Seeing as we're in Melbourne, footy team?
Now I have to admit, James, I'm a heathen. I don't have a footy team. I'm sorry. I do have friends who love it, And so I go across with them. I actually went only recently to watch a game with them. So I'll go to 1 or 2 games a year. I actually
Hmm.
like watching the game because it's a very strategic game. It's a very athletic game. I don't have time to follow it because the sports I follow are cycling, and we've just finished the Giro. And the other one, if I'm not doing anything else and have a bit of time, football, which you might know more of as soccer.
Mm, wonderful.
So
Now
I
I
don't
have to.
really have time. And once a year I get to watch Test cricket because I love Test cricket.
That's what I was going to say. I have spotted Paula live in person at a sporting event, and I believe it was cricket.
So a
Yeah.
friend of mine played for Australia, and I've also known some other cricketers as well. So I sometimes get, the ex-players and friends invite into the MCG, and it's a very nice invite. So
Yeah. Okay. Right. Now let's go over and have a bit of a chat just about your career to date. So you've forged a very diverse career, Paula. Superannuation, telecommunications, executive level roles, consultancy roles. It all started out perhaps more conventionally at what we know as PwC today, or Coopers and Lybrand then. If you think back to when you started and you took that role at PwC, what were your career goals back then, Paula?
the reason I went there, James, because I loved how you're saying how I planned my career. It was very generous of you, James. The reason I went to PwC was because I knew I loved business, because my dad was a businessman and we'd always enjoyed it. And we'd go out and look at old mines. That's how I got involved in investing originally. Um, and so my original investment account, I wasn't actually legally able to have an account, and I didn't realize that for years. What I hadn't realised is my dad had a second account, which was I thought was mine. Turns out legally it wasn't, but I didn't find that out for years later. So that's how I started. I knew I loved business, so I did finance and computing at uni, did a double, and so I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I figured I would go consulting, and that way people would pay me to go around and see different types of businesses, and so I'd get more experience and get to have an idea.
Excellent, excellent.
It wasn't great planning, I'd have to admit, James, but that was it.
I think a number of people end up by default in these big consulting businesses, and yeah, it's really it'd be really interesting to see how your next step, which within 10 years of being at PwC, you had decided to go out on your own in your own consulting business and this was for the first time.
Yep,
You had um, salaried executive roles after this,
yep,
but actually quite early on in your career, you went out on your own in a consulting fashion. I
yep.
guess what gave you the confidence to do that?
I was approached by someone else I'd worked with. So from consulting, I'd had some terrific jobs, but one of the things I'd noticed was in financial services, I'd get a lot of responsibility, and just because I was young, people didn't question it. So I thought, right, financial services. From financial services, someone I'd worked with had gone back to the US, and they were looking for someone to help them, and they wanted a foreigner, i.e., someone who's not American, to go and help them and do some work in China. And so that was actually the reason why I went over and did some work with the Chinese government, ironically through the US State Department. And that was just tremendous because a lot of that was internet, and it was understanding why do you need ramification for listing or having, Western style businesses, if you will, and how do you structure those businesses, and what are the risks and the strategies that you might want to think about deploying. So it was just a hell of a lot of fun, really. Mind you, that was also when I was studying the CFA, which possibly wasn't my wisest decision, James, to fly around the world and study the CFA at the same time. There we go.
But essentially, would you say that the opportunity sort of presented itself on a platter and you just said yes, basically?
So yeah, a friend of mine, I said, "Would you be interested?" And I thought, "Yep." And so off we went. So yeah, it was
Mm,
just great. So I had to do interviews and all that sort of thing. But yeah, it was just fortuitous that it came about, really. Mm.
yeah. I think there's definitely some good advice in that in your career. I think for there's a lot of young ones on this call. You should really it is about saying yes to
Yeah.
opportunities in general.
And sometimes, like I did pretty early on, I realized I had made a hell of a mistake doing the CFA at the same time. I was flying from anywhere in China, potentially, to I was still doing some work over in New York, or I was coming back to Australia. And it was just not the time to be studying the CFA when you're doing all of that. But I'd already started, so I didn't want to quit. And I worked out, well, you know, bitten off this much, you may as well get to work and do a bit more chewing.
Mm.
So it
Excellent.
was fun.
Now, eventually, after doing that and working very hard, traveling, studying, you return to salaried work with all that experience gained as a consultant
Yep.
as a CEO of a major superannuation business.
Yeah. So that was when
Aspire.
I decided I wanted to come back to Australia. I'd had enough of the travelling.
Mm. Now, if you think now about the role of a CEO,
Mm.
there's an expression I heard they say it's lonely at the top, Paula.
Yep.
And I think it's sort of something to think about. There's a number of people on this call who are younger and they might be at PwC or they might be at um, some other law firm even.
Mm.
Now, what are the things you think young people should know about the CEO of the business? You know, what are the challenges? And if they get
mm.
an interaction, how do you think they should approach the CEO to sort of benefit them? What do you think?
Yeah, a couple of things. So your expression lonely at the top is true. And it's one of those things, it strikes you in those moments when everyone just goes scrum and just goes, what do we do now? You
Mm,
know, and you're thinking, what? Not a word of advice. You know, that's when you really, really know that you're the CEO, when you get those moments and you're thinking, and there's no good answer. And you will get so many of those. So what does a young person, or what might be optimal for a young person to do in presenting to a CEO? Try and appear normal. Don't appear too overly excited. Um, you know, they're the same as everyone else, and they get enough people being extra courteous to them. You know, unless there's something wrong with their ego, they really don't need more people bowing and scraping. Appear normal, and try and engage in a conversation. If they ask you, what are you working on? Because they're trying to engage with you and talk about something that you can talk about and something you're hopefully comfortable with, then try and engage with them. I mean, don't spill the guts if your boss is making a mess of things. That's
mm,
probably not going to be a good idea. But just try and be straightforward and honest about how you're finding things. Be a little bit circumspect if things aren't great, because they want to know, but it's probably not politically smart for you to be the person doing it if you're too junior.
mm,
Just try and be normal. You know, so for that CEO's role, I always had a policy that my EA picked up on very quickly, because she would try and insist to me that she would be making my coffees for me. And I would be telling her she was not making my coffees, thank you. I was going into the kitchen and I'd push the little button and do it all by myself. And part of the reason I did it was have a break, but the other part of the reason I did it was just so I could talk to people.
mm,
Because if they come near my office, it's a very different environment. And it does, and my door's always open. You can come and see me, that's fine, but it's still a very different office. And it was noticeable the number of times I'd go into the kitchen, then all of a sudden a couple of extra people would suddenly turn up in the kitchen. And I would just get to hang out for a couple of extra minutes if I had the time, and just get to talk to people and find out how they were going and how they were feeling. And it was a nice thing for me personally to get to do. But also it was actually also a good feel for the business to understand how different parts of the business were feeling.
mm. Yeah, good insight there. I think it's something. It's true of any senior leader, isn't it? You know, if you can, as a young person in the business, I think the senior people are always very keen to hear from you.
Yeah,
So it's a good opportunity to build a connection. But I think
yeah,
it's what Paula said is very right. Not sort of, you don't want to go overboard in terms of too much information about how good things are
yep,
and come across as unauthentic,
yep,
or how bad things are.
no. And
Mm,
those things might be bad, but there is usually going to be a couple of people you can tell. If you are, and I'm assuming your people on this call might be a bit more junior. If you are too junior, the risk of going straight to the CEO is you really might have put yourself in a not a good position. There's no,
Mm.
and let's say it's your boss, there will normally be other people you can try and talk to around it. So if there is that circumstance, and I'm not saying hide it, for heaven's sakes, please don't do that, but be conscious about the best path for you, because you still have to do something about it ethically, I'm assuming, but you need to be a bit smart as well.
Mm. Okay. Now, in terms of I'm really in awe of the breadth of the roles you've done in terms of executive, non-executive director roles over the past 20 years across the US, Australia, Papua New Guinea now. It seems you've really cherry-picked the most interesting challenges and roles. So, perhaps first question is, how have you chosen what you're going to do next? And then what have been the highlights, Paula?
The ones I choose are the ones I think I can help impact the most. So that might be, so Papua New Guinea is a classic example. It's a country with a number of problems. It's their largest super fund, so hopefully we can shift the dial there. And what have been the highlights have been things I've been able to change. So some years ago, and it's been implemented twice now, I designed a product that will help lift lesser developed countries into developed status economies. And it's just it's basically just a long-term wealth and education sort of model is really all it is. So it's those sorts of things where I've been able to change things and help improve things a bit. I've enjoyed.
Hmm. Okay. I think that I've certainly tried to do that in my career to date too, is try and choose roles where there's an interest for me and there's a bit of a need, there's a
Yeah,
learning in it.
and people
Mm.
have to figure out what some people want. I obviously have not had a normal career, but some people definitely just want a normal career, say an employee. There's nothing wrong with that, and you can have a lot of fun doing it.
Mm.
It's just learning about what works best for you, what makes you feel happiest in your life, and
Mm.
you go and do that.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of the current macro geopolitical investment themes. Now, I love a recent LinkedIn post that you've made, and I'd really encourage everyone on the call to follow Paula's LinkedIn. In particular, one regard Mr. Trump, of course, macro
He's been figuring a bit of late, James, I'm afraid, yes.
and macro versus micro in sort
Yeah,
of a time of a lot of uncertainty. Now, you characterized the situation recently is the USA unraveling the system that they themselves created
yep,
post World War II. The whole world order that they created post World War
yep,
II, they are now unraveling themselves.
yes.
Is that still the way you'd basically characterize the current situation?
Yes, and Trump has gone so far now you can't unwind it. So up until World War II, and certainly up until the early 1900s, both the Western world and Eastern world, as they were typically quite separate then, really weren't characterized by the stability we've all grown up with. And I'm assuming most of us have grown up in, say, countries like New Zealand and Australia. Post World War II, the US essentially was the leader of an international law concept, the UN concept. You know, the law of the sea had existed with the Portuguese and the Spanish, but they actually codified quite a lot of that, and they codified the minerals and the access and those sorts of issues. So there's a lot about the stable world that we grew up in that actually comes from the US. I'm not saying they were lily white, believe me, but they put a lot of structures in place. What Trump has done is he's unraveling those structures. And now, even if Trump disappeared tomorrow, you and Abraham Lincoln, who would be easily my favourite president, even if Abraham Lincoln somehow came back tomorrow, he could not re-establish the US. And there's two reasons for it. One, now everyone in the world has seen how quickly and how easily the US can undermine the international order. So even if you had Abraham Lincoln, you might have the next Trump version of a president in only a couple of years. And two, even if you did get someone of good intent who wanted to re-establish that world we all grew up in, that level of certainty, could you now have the credibility and the money to reestablish it? Just look at the damage from USAID,
Mm,
or Voice of America in Europe, and that damage. It doesn't matter how well intentioned you might be as a US president, you can't reestablish that world now. So that world is now gone. So now we are permanently in a different world. The question is, how does that world evolve now, in my view?
mm. And I guess so much media gets devoted to Donald Trump, and I think this has been his success, really. He's completely taken up all the political oxygen in the world.
Yep.
Um, in a recent article, you said, well, look, he may well be misguided,
Mm.
but he is consistent in his views. So, for an investor, do you
Mm.
believe you can actually predict the policy direction of the US going forward?
Yes, actually, I think actually he's unusual in that way. For geopolitics, he's actually more predictable than most are. So historically, geopolitics, a lot of my work historically has been with trading houses more than investment houses, even though I'm a CFA charter holder, and that's a lot of my background. And the reason for that has been in an investment world, a lot of the perspective has been geopolitics has been stable, it's been predictable. Whereas in a trading world, yes, it has obviously lived in the same world, but if they got one thing wrong, given the nature of their transactions and how big they were, that could alter the history of a BHP, for example. Whereas it wouldn't alter the history of a BlackRock because you'd have so many investments. Now, as you're moving into this world with less surety in the geopolitics, more instability, now investment houses are starting to get more interested. So recently I had a comment from a couple of very senior CIOs in Australia about how geopolitics is the same the world over. And now they're starting to realize that it's not. And it's that predictability, as much as you can get it from Trump, he's actually more predictable than most politicians. He
Mm,
actually does do what he said he would do, even if the people who voted for him maybe didn't think he was actually really going to do it. But if
mm,
you go back and read Trump's 20-point expositions on what he stood for, because
mm,
that website is still live, you can still
mm,
go back and read it.
mm. From 2020,
No, his
from
20
20.
points that he did his he ran for election for this term because his ethos on each term has changed a bit.
Mm,
If you look at what he ran for on this term, and I think it's donaldjtrump.com or something like that,
mhm,
it's this term, and you'll see it clearly. He says 2024, there's 20 points. So this isn't the Heritage Project, which is the 990 pages, I think it was. And that was even more detailed, God help us, and scary. This is Donald Trump's 20-point view of the world. And he is doing exactly what he said he would do. And he's unusual for that. But
mm,
and the thing that maybe we need to give more credence to in the investment world is that can tell us what to invest in. It can also tell us what not to invest in, because it can tell us where the risks might be that from a investment perspective, we may not want to. So I think I'm not saying he's 100% predictable, far from it. I think he is actually more predictable than most politicians you see. And I think in looking for that, don't just look for what are the good investment ideas there for. And the obvious one has been shipbuilding that he's been talking about.
mm,
I think there's ramifications about how you can do that in the US. There's ways you can't do that, I think, in the US. And I wrote an article on that recently.
mm,
So it can tell you about what to invest in. It can also tell you what not to invest in. So
mm,
shipbuilding might be a classic example. You might instead look at, I think Italy and Japan were the other two.
mm.
Because
The he said recently, I think he was in, might have been in Detroit, and he said, this will be the Rust Belt no more. He said, do you think this is feasible? Do you think he genuinely can bring industry back for the
James,
long term in America? And at the same time take industry away from China, Vietnam, even in places like maybe even Australia in relation to steel and things. What do you
yeah,
think?
James, this is the man who since the 1980s has been saying tariffs are lovely. So there is a part of me that does think that he's a raving nutter, and he knows about as much about economics as I know about nuclear physics.
Mm.
So yes, I do think he's predictable. That doesn't mean I think, God help us, you should follow him over the cliff edge. Can you make Detroit the non-rust bucket of the USA? Good luck with that. I think so. I think the classic example is we've all seen the memes about Americans, including Trump, building little iPhones in future. I think some of those memes have been hilarious, and they have beautifully captured where the US can't go in manufacturing. But there are actually places the US can go in manufacturing, and there are smart reasons why it will. So one of the ones is chips production. If you look at, and by that I mean silicon chips. And I don't just mean silicon chips in the wider future, but for now, yes, because there's some very sexy creations and inventions going on about new types of chips. Because don't forget, the silicon chip invention is decades old. But let's just restrict this conversation for silicon chips with the little asterisk that I'm not suggesting it's the only thing about there. So Biden and Trump the first time, then Biden have really forced TSMC to set up fabs in Arizona. So they've set up the fabs. There's also now, though, a packaging fab. Because if you remember back in last October, people were yahooing about how great it was that the US had its own fab, chip manufacturing plant, I should say, and wasn't that marvelous? And what they weren't realizing is all of those chips, as soon as they were made in Arizona, got shipped back to Taiwan. Because at that stage, and still now, Taiwan is the only country in the world on a commercial scale that can package chips. So those chips that were, yes, coming off the production line in Arizona were actually weren't commercially viable. But the important thing about them, if something happens to Taiwan, the US now has at least a current level of chip production massively more expensive than producing them in Taiwan. It's only now producing just down the road, an hour and a half drive. There is a packaging plant being built. That plant's not due, I think, until August. I think it was. It's Akron. Then that's a classic investment opportunity. I've been looking at their share price, and it's like I can't work out why people aren't watching this company, because it should be going through the roof. But whatever, they're not watching it. So think of like building up a chip, a silicon chip. It's a bit like building a hamburger. You have to have different parts to make them all work together. So just producing the silicon chip isn't enough to have that computer chip work. So what you have to do is put it together. That's called packaging. And there's a different company about an hour and a half drive down the road that's currently developing a packaging chip. The other really important one is in the Middle East. TSMC are currently talking about building an alternative there. And then the other ones you look at is Germany and Japan. They both started a few years ago. One of the really crucial things about all of that, though, is the research is still really in Taiwan, and that's the guts of it. That's the heart and soul of chips. There's going to be some research built in Arizona. So if something happens to Taiwan tomorrow, let's say it did all get blown to bits for whatever reason, then the US, as we stand now, is actually probably going to would be the best position of any country in the world. So there's investment opportunities there that I think people aren't looking at. I'd still look at Germany and Japan in particular. So there's those sorts of opportunities that, it is obviously manufacturing. It is nothing like at the economy that Taiwan is. But if Taiwan disappears off the planet for a reason tomorrow, it becomes very investable. So it's about 160 billion, I think, US all up. So 6.6 billion went to TSMC alone from the US government. So that sort of manufacturing is viable. Making iPhones and, non-rust bucketing the look of Detroit, you're dreaming, mate. But so he does carry on like a clown, let's be honest. He's not exactly an economist. So in saying he's predictable, I'm not saying I think his economic theory is a sensible change. Let me try and put that nicely.
And I think it's worth just, I think if we're thinking about macro themes today, I think this is just such an integral one, we should just bottom it out. So your view is that ultimately this America First thesis and this way of thinking in the US is going to be fairly sticky. It's probably going to carry on post this term. And do you think then that's going to have ramifications in the Pacific in terms of our the focus of the US in the Pacific and places like that, and we
Well,
have to be prepared for that, basically.
I don't think this is driven by Trump. I think Trump is a response to underlying forces, if you will. I think we live in and James knows my thinking on this, but not everyone here will. We live in a time of the megatrends. So if you look at history, go back to the spinning jenny, you had the spinning jenny and steam train working together. You can all read that in your own time. You're now in a period of history where there are at least 5 or 6, and if you ask some people divide it up and say there's 12 different massive forces at once. I think that's getting a little bit carried away personally, but there are some structural systematic changes going on in the world. So one is the rate of technological change that you can see. So let's date it from the iPhone and go forward. You can see that. Another one is the demise of infrastructure, and it's mostly post-World War II infrastructure, but it needs to be replaced because that's the heart, that's the roads and the rails and the bridges on which economies operate. So the other one is, say, renewables and electricity transition. There are fundamental forces at play that are changing how this world all interrelates and gets along or doesn't get along with each other. Part of that is the geopolitical consequence. Why the US and China are knocking heads against each other and have been for some years isn't because of Donald Trump. He's a consequence of that. So there have been up-team books written on why we're all going to war and all sorts of things like that. You can read those in your pastime as well.
Mm.
Donald Trump isn't the driver of it. He's just one of the outcomes. So make America great again. Hate that whole expression, but so there. That is just a consequence of how people react. So many years ago, I used to live under a military dictatorship, and people will react in a certain way if you treat them a certain way. All you're seeing in America is people reacting in a certain way because they feel forgotten. There's been massive elites that have done exceptionally well. Your average American doesn't. If your average American, say, gets cancer, there's something like 760 people who declare bankruptcy every day in the US because of a medical diagnosis. So that's people in our sort of family backgrounds, and your family is just wiped out economically. There's people who, I can tell you, I grew up in this country. I can tell you people who, when I went to school, when I got to go to university, if you worked it yourself, even if you went to the worst state school, well, maybe not the worst state school, but even if you worked to not really good state school, you could get to university. I don't know how those kids could get to university now. So in a lot of countries around the world, you're seeing people who are reacting to they feel like they've been left behind. And that's really what Donald Trump represents. That's how he got elected.
Now, Greg's just asked a question just in relation to the debt load of the US. Do you sort of have any view on that?
Yeah, I've only touched, sorry, on my 3 publications, I've only touched on that briefly. I think, I only issued this, I think, a couple months ago. I think what Donald Trump, God help us, is going to do, or what I said I thought he might do, is issue a new currency that will be a cryptocurrency. And for someone who likes to avoid debt, let's look at his history. For someone who doesn't respect the central bank, again, let's look at his history. That would be a very messy way for someone in his position to feel like he's a smart guy and he's got it over those know-it-all types. And that could put the US debt in an even worse position. And the moment you have the Treasury Secretary saying, we would never, not honour our debts, is, of course, the first time everyone goes, excuse me? The US Secretary said what? And that just scares the life out of everyone. I
Mm.
think I think it's very unwise. And this is part of my concern with Trump. He's declared bankruptcy 6 times.
Mm.
I don't think he necessarily gets the consequence of
Yeah.
what he's doing and what it has on a country. So if you go back and read his 20 points,
Mm.
he wants a strong currency. He wants to get rid of inflation. And you're looking at things going, mate, I just don't think you've been listening to anyone about how this is going.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
He does still have some people's ear, or some people still have his ear, I should say. So they have to be warning him that if you push this button, US declaring bankruptcy or US not paying some debt, that is a terrible risk. All you have to do is look at the bond rates.
Mm.
And a lot of, even in investing markets, maybe a lot of people don't pay due respect to the bond markets because they're always there. They're sort of stable. I mean, they're not sometimes, but they're reliable. The thing is, most people in investment markets have never lived in an economy where
Mm.
that's not the case, and they maybe haven't seen what those consequences are. So
Mm.
years ago, to give you a hint, the country I lived in was Argentina. Well, Argentina has defaulted 9 times, so it's a world record, not one you want to hold. You don't want to be in a country that has that circumstance, and God help all of us if the US has that. So my hope is they pull him up, but the problem is you've already introduced the doubt. People are already having this conversation. So
Mm.
you've damaged the market. You've already damaged the US currency. And you could argue that in a land of blind people, a one-eyed giant is still the king. Great, but he's still a one-eyed giant. It still leaves us in a much worse position for all of us.
Yeah. Let's talk about another one of those mega trends, which now you've been a judge for the Telstra Business Award. You were a winner of the Telstra Woman Business Awards as well. Um, you've worked in technology, in consulting roles and executive roles. If we think about artificial intelligence, now we've got Kevin on the call who's doing a PhD in artificial intelligence
Good on you,
from
Kevin.
RMIT. So
Yep.
I won't get you to sort of go head to head in terms of what it is, but what do you think
Kevin will know more than I do, I feel sure, don't worry.
more from a incumbent technology business point of view, how fundamentally changing to businesses like Telstra and the like do you think it'll be?
So the example I give my clients is think about the buggy and think about the horse and buggy and think about how the world had no idea how much the world would change when the car came along. Because it's not just a car, it became trucks. It became road networks. It became my village and the next door village. And we mix so much, our accents got to the same. You go to some old countries where they don't travel, you go to village to village, accents can be different. You go around the US, for example, and Australia, you have to go hundreds of miles before you find a different accent because people travel so much. That's cars. We had no way of really seeing back in the days of the horse and buggy how much the car would really change, not just an economy, but society and your expectations. AI is going to be the same. We're not going to have any idea.
Hmm. What do you think about in terms of businesses, the accounting and the law professions?
So
Do
anything
you,
like that we can already see, they're already going to be dead. Sorry, so I'm not talking about the immediate things. So sorry, James, I'm probably not answering the question well. I'm not talking about the immediate things. Think about the horse and buggy. People say, oh, the car can drive down the road a couple of miles. That's us talking about accounting. That's us talking about law. We already know that's done. Those issues, I mean, they're not actually dead yet, but they will be. Don't worry, that's a matter of time. It's the other things we can't see yet. It's the consequences of those actions. So no one really that I've ever been able to see foresaw the road system the way it turned out. Because people just thought cars were going to drive down rutted roads. No one saw bitumen. No one saw gutters and sewerage as whole new systems because that changed how people lived. That's what AI is going to change that we're not seeing. Things like accounting and law, they're already dead. Just time hasn't passed enough for that to actually happen yet, James.
Mm,
We already know
mm,
about those ones. They're not the big ones. The big ones are going to be the systems that are built that we don't see are getting built because we're not thinking well. So it's not just law, it's how that changes law. So it might be, can I start, one of the things in law is, let's say I accidentally run, let's keep the car thing. I accidentally run someone over with my car and I kill them. How much of that was foreseeable? Now that becomes entirely different in an AI world.
True.
So does my liability, you'd have to think my liability has to change. So my health insurance changes. So my car insurance changes. So my employability changes because my employer and prospective future employers now know about my history. There's whole plumbings, if you will, to the structure of your economy and the structure of your society that changes. And that's what people aren't thinking about, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a very good one. I hadn't thought of it in that context, but certainly there's potential for kind of like it's like that known unknowns thing, and unknown unknowns.
Unspelled, God help us
Yes,
all. Yes.
the it's kind of like those unknown unknowns might become known unknowns.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing this for decades. And it's really going to be fascinating because
Mm.
it is that's going to knock up against all the other changes. So that knocks up against demographic changes. That
Mm.
knocks up against geopolitical changes. So just go as simple as a supply chain or a fragile, bringing fragility into your supply chain. It's the whole, I'll call it plumbing of your
Mm.
structures, but it's not just an economic structure. When you've got to change that big, it's a societal structure. And this is where the Donald Trump issue comes back. So how the hell do you do all of those change and have the people who've been feeling left behind not
Mm.
feeling left behind anymore?
Mm.
And if you've
Mm.
got the demographics in just about every country of the world that we've all got, except for countries like Papua New Guinea, that everyone else has got massive demographic problems, then we need to bring them along because demographically we need them to contribute.
Mm. I think, yeah, it certainly does. It's going to hit back to that sort of concept of autonomy in society, isn't it? And people feeling like they've still got some level of control, and if they don't, then we become susceptible to sort of authoritarian leaders and populists.
And that's a cycle. This
Mm.
does feel to me a lot like the 1930s in a lot of ways. It's a cycle, and well, you can look more recently at a country like Argentina. People hit back,
Mm.
but a lot of people lose their lives, and a lot of people, lose a lot to get there.
Mm. Another mega trend, and you mentioned it, and it's close to my understanding as well, as the energy transition.
Yep.
And the concept, the energy transition, gets thrown around a lot. To me, it's very unfortunate that something as boring as electricity has become such a political topic. If you think about things that should be political, I just don't think electricity should be one of them. It's one that surely the engineers should be able to sort out. However, we're certainly now in a world where the energy super majors are stepping back from renewables
Yeah.
uh, slightly and more overtly, really, by the day. Where do you see that trend heading, Paula? Do you think we are going to see a reversion back to clean coal, as Trump likes to say, or
Drill, baby, drill.
drill, baby, drill? What do you sort of think?
I
What do you
think that's
think?
a bit of a sideshow, James, to be honest.
Mm,
Purely by coincidence, One of the books I'm reading at the moment is on Edison. And so when you started talking about energy should be boring, I'm sorry, I was having a bit of a giggle because I'm actually in the section of the book talking about how him versus Alexander Graham Bell, and there was a German fellow and who thought of what first, and each proving the other did something smarter. And it was just, and it's the same old story. It's human nature. We haven't changed, God help us. I think it's just a sideshow. So the current withdrawal, it's exactly the same, and it tells you about character. It tells you about, so let's go back to what companies do you want to work for? Have a look at the legal firms pulling DEI and bending the knee to Donald Trump versus if they fully decided not to in the US. It's like performative art. It's what to do to get past the current emperor and not upset him now. And what they're doing is they're pulling back simply so they don't get picked on, if you will. So look at the
Mm,
substance of it, what changes. And the substance of it won't change. I think we're going to be too late. I think the shocks we'll have from climate change are going to be quite a bit worse, I think, than what people are expecting. And I think that simply because the lessons of history say human beings are too dumb, too self-involved to get off our backsides and do something in good enough time, and we leave things until too late, and then things go rather awfully wrong, and then we fix it. It's only when things start going awfully wrong, the human beings traditionally, I'm going to argue by history, tend to start fixing things. So this is just unfortunately going to be another one of those delays, James. I don't
mm,
think it unchanges the fundamentals. So drill,
mm,
baby, drill, which is in Trump's top 20, God help us. I don't see that happening. The clean coal, thank heavens, I don't see that really happening. There
mm,
might be some clean coal, given the US's history. I can't see drill, baby, drill. Um, the nuclear argument, though, does have legitimacy in certain jurisdictions around the world. So China
mm,
is the classic example for nuclear. The big issue we're going to have, I think, in the world will actually, and people aren't mentioning it yet, and they should be, it's China turning coal into liquefied and other energy forms. That's sort of like the big ugly coal heap that the world doesn't see because it's kept domestic, and actually it doesn't release figures that, as best as I'm aware, in certainly not in any level of detail. That's the sort of thing I think we're not focusing on as a world, and we really should be. Whereas right now, if you do it, it's going to sound like you're beating up China.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and it
mm,
actually isn't. They actually count, I think if you pulled them out, it would be China, USA, and then China using coal for liquefied would be the third largest country if it was a country
mm.
for burning in the world. So
I
it's
think.
not bashing up on China. It actually is a legitimate issue.
Mm,
So there are a lot of issues that we haven't really started the conversation.
mm. I know it's interesting because I think at a high level we all agree that the path to renewables is obviously feels like it's got sufficient momentum, uh, and we've come a long way. But when we look at the companies, and this is something Sergio and I have done over the last few years, is we've looked at companies like Siemens, and we've looked at a number of these businesses that have been in a lot of solar companies in the US, for example, battery companies in the US. And frankly, from an investment viewpoint, they've been very poor,
Mm.
very poor performers. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that, first of all, you've got to remember that energy systems around the world were basically built by the government everywhere,
And
effectively.
they're the only ones with the money and
Yeah,
the ability to just get up and get it done. Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
And the energy transition with renewables has sort of been, yes, it's been about that, but it's also been about sort of deregulation of the markets as well, and basically allowing anybody essentially to come in and build renewables, wind farms and solar farms. And this is exactly sort of the issue that in Australia is a perfect case. And it's funny, I find, Paula, because for me, my sort of natural free market side of me is a bit conflicted here because I can just see that I don't actually necessarily, I think this is actually part of the problem. You've got so many different developers of renewables, all doing their own thing, all well-meaning, and then you've got the realities of the system. You've only got one system connected, one operator,
Australia is a classic
one
example.
regulator,
Yep.
and basically it's caused a very haphazard implementation. And
Yes.
um, I think this is the problem, and it's for that reason why so many projects have not proven good investments, and why the even the sellers of turbines and things that have
Yep.
taken on
Yep.
risk around EPC have lost a lot of money. And this is kind of just the way it's sort of playing out. It feels like we know where we want to go, but we're sort of walking there in a very zigzaggy sort of manner.
Yes, we are. So how do you do that? I'd go back, and I think Australia, unfortunately, is a really good example, James.
Mm,
So you can look at people on properties selling rights to their property, and it may never have anything anywhere near it, but it's
mm.
causing absolute disquiet in local communities
Yeah, it
because,
is. Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. You can look at the Snowy Hydro scheme, and the government at a certain stage just said, we are doing X. If you
Mm,
look at politics now, you're only in politics for a couple of years. Maybe there's too much competition. Maybe there's too much media. You really now, in my view, have to set up an authority, give them the authority to do it, which they've sort of done with some parts of that journey in Australia. But you basically need, God help us, a well-meaning oligarch, and you have to
mm,
have a corruption watchdog right next door, but it has to be a corruption watchdog with teeth, because
mm,
the moment, and you need to have, but you need to have an authority set up, be it the Snowy Mountain Authority, be it a proper renewables authority. You can look at the debate Australia has about the fast train, comes around every election typically. Um,
mm,
It's the same rubbish. I can't see the fast train. I haven't been involved looking at some numbers for one some years ago. I can't see Australia having that population anytime too soon. So I can't see that working terribly well for this country unless we change the gauges system in this country, and then you have a freight issue potentially. But that wouldn't be a fast train. Um,
mm,
so if you wanted to get those sort of projects done now, I think you have to have an authority set up. And I think that means you also need to very quickly have a corruption
mm,
watchdog with
mm.
teeth. So a bit like the New South Wales model, not like the rest of us.
Yeah, I think on this one, I sort of feel that there is a role for government, I think, in the energy market. And I think
It's too big.
central planning is needed. And I know New Zealand is actually heading in this direction again
Okay.
with a central buyer model likely implemented. So, and that's something to be
Is there a
wary
good
of if
thing to look
you're.
at in New Zealand that I can look up, do you think?
You should look up the Transpower chairman, Keith Turner, and the
Yeah.
last speech he gave. I think that would be a risk to the share price of the New Zealand gentailers. Actually, be something if you're investing in those companies, you should be a little wary. Now,
Okay.
just one other item I just wanted to bring up in relation to these trends is the recent role you've taken on as a director of the superannuation company for basically the largest one in Papua New Guinea.
Yep.
It's an interesting place, Paula, and when you took it up, I thought, that's an interesting thing to take on, and I could sort of see the pieces matching up if you think about Peter V'landys and the NRL looking to put a team there. And then if you consider perhaps the US soft power retreating in that area, China soft power increasing, it could be an important little country, Papua New Guinea, going forward. Do you have
Yeah.
any insights into what's going on over there? What's
So my thoughts, not necessarily an insight, sorry, James,
no?
just to differentiate a little bit there. Papua New Guinea is the largest country in the Pacific, and the Pacific gives anyone access to a thing called the Timor Trop, if you know about it. So if you, for example, were one of the countries in the world that had a submarine and you wanted to get through this part of the world from, say, China, the US, across to the Middle East, Africa, around that way, or you wanted to come back, the deepest part is the Timor Trough, which is just south of Timor. That would obviously be a very important listening post, and geopolitically it's crucial. It's one of the key ways through as well if you want to avoid the Southeast China Sea, which is increasingly under China. Actually wrote an article on that recently. That's really, really key. The other thing that's really important is it's been publicly acknowledged by the US that their most important asset outside of US soil in the world is Pine Gap. If you think about minerals and metals and mining, particularly sea mining in the world, the Pacific is crucial. So on any of those issues and all of those issues, Papua New Guinea is, and there's, you will recall, go back about, wouldn't be 18 months, it might be actually, a little bit of a while ago now, there was some talk, and this was published in the Free Press, about was the Solomons sold out to a senior politician and his family for the sum of $20 million US, and did that change the whole direction our country was apparently thinking of going in? There's risks that you have in the Pacific that you may be more subject to than you would be in other countries, purely for economic reasons. And on a personal level, my view is Papua New Guinea did an awful lot for my country some years ago in World War II, and I'm not sure Australia ever really repaid that.
Really good, really interesting comments there. I think there's some reading to be done for all of us, perhaps, in relation to those, in relation to the importance of those of the Pacific. And Pine Gap, of course, for people who don't know, is the military base in Alice Springs.
It's not strictly military; it's a security base. So it does have military personnel there as well as perhaps it would have civilians, you would think. But it's a listening post.
Yeah. Now, perhaps we'll go for another 10 minutes in terms of questions, and then if there's any Q&A, please put them in the chat. But if we just sort of think about careers now, Paula, and if you were sort of starting out again, what do you think you would study?
Oh, so I did finance and computing. The other big one I played with was, would I do law? And I didn't do law because if I didn't do law, I thought it would be too restricting. I wouldn't get as much business experience than if I did finance and computing. I'd probably still think the same things. I would now, though, have more of an emphasis of studying overseas. And back then I didn't. So I stayed in Australia, and my postgrads have been overseas based. I would now more head overseas now, because Australia is just becoming too small.
Yeah. And I think that basically answers the other question I had around how you would use your university years differently. You'd look to get that overseas experience.
So I'd actually, Trump accepting, I'd actually try and go to the US if I could. If I couldn't do that, I'd do something like the UK or an INSEAD, because most of the world really does business in English. My other language is Spanish, so I could do that. Go to Spain as well. They're very well regarded. So you want to think about where do you want to go in future. Australia has an obvious future with China. Australia is going to have a conflicted future with China, and it's going to be on again and off again. And I think that's going to be for the rest of our lives, I think. You've got 30 plus years of the mega trends, so these pressures aren't about to go away. So that would be another relevant one. But your issue with China is going to be, people will look at it and they're going to have to make a judgment for themselves what side of the fence they think people are on. So anyone potentially going down that path, my caution would be, make sure you're comfortable what you're doing and where you want to go, and that's right for you.
I'd just ask another quick one, just because we've got Ing Chu on the line. He's from Cambodia. I mean, a lot of the people have come here to Australia to study.
Yep.
They've done what you've said, Paula, but they've come to Australia. Kevin from China. You've got Henry not sure where you're from, Henry, but maybe I'm not going to hazard a guess. We've got Yaswell from New Delhi, Yuan from
Okay.
Colombia.
So they've come to Australia for an education.
Exactly.
So if they stay in Australia, that looks good because they've got a local qualification. And if they want to go home, depending what university and what courses they're doing, that can look good because that could be a well-regarded course. So from their perspective, sorry, I was answering from my
Mm,
perspective that I grew up with, but from their perspective, that could work well.
mm. In terms of Southeast Asia, Paula, which of the South do you, are you a big believer in? You know, they're the ones with the growing populations.
Oh yeah,
Whenever we,
Australia is for children. We are. I mean, talk about the lucky country. We seriously don't deserve the skerrick of our luck. You know, you can call
mm,
it sheep's back. You can call it mining and minerals, and now that Australia just happens to be where it is geographically in the world, we don't really deserve a skerrick of our luck. But yes, we are in the right spot. Mm.
mm, mm. Okay, a couple of more. We've got some questions in the chat, but one I wanted to ask is this is one perhaps for people who are a bit on their career, executive coaching. Is that something that you have done yourself, or is that something that you have offered to other people in terms of current executives, or what do you think the value of it is?
I think it's invaluable. So I've used executive coaches. I've actually changed them over the course of my life, depending on what I need. Um, So I do, I have a very wise soul that I can drop in on and chew the fat with. Um, I find it invaluable because, there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me, but there are so many things I don't see. So for me to be able to sit down with someone and say, this happened, this person reacted like this. What the hell am I missing? Just to have someone, particularly in the early, my dad worked for himself, so he had his own businesses. I didn't get office politics, and I thought people went to work to work. Um, I didn't realise people went to work for all sorts of other reasons. I come from outback Australia. That just didn't happen in that world. People just weren't wired that way. So I started work, and it was a really odd experience for me.
Mm,
So I'm probably a bit dumber than most people. But I do think there are opportunities that you can have just to have someone who's just been around more than you have, who you can just talk to and just say, what am I missing? Or what should I be thinking about? All those sorts of things. I think that's invaluable in my view, James. So I have on and off, not consistent, not constantly, but on and off throughout my life, I've kept someone, if you will. I've employed someone. And for me, in terms of me giving back and helping other people develop, I tend to do some of these sorts of things. And there's usually a couple of people that I'm sort of helping a bit at a time.
mm.
It varies a bit.
Another related point is just in relation to say, professional bodies and things. And you mentioned at the start you're very involved with the Chartered Financial Analyst Society.
Mhm.
How have you sort of used those? And think about people on the call.
Yep.
What advice would you give in terms of using whether it's CFA or whether it's some other sort of one?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Um, I think so. There's two issues. One is um, for what so what can you learn from them, if you will? So there's a couple of good associations like that you can join with that might be useful. That might be good networking and help you meet people. Like e.g., I'm not from Melbourne, so just think about what are the circles, what are the opportunities you have. There's also issues about is there something, pardon me, wider you might want to do. So the two associations that I've really helped with have been Chartered Accountants and the CFA, because they're the two qualifications that really made a difference in my life. So for the Chartered Accountants, for some reason, they also approached me. So for 10 years, I used to be in a quasi-judicial role with them hearing alleged misconduct cases. But I was also a chairman of the CAs in Victoria. So there's certain things like that I've given back to because they've just been crucial in I wouldn't have the life I have without those two qualifications. So I've just given back more time to those. So it depends what you want out of it. Is it a networking thing? Is it a learning thing? Is it something you want to get back to?
Mm. Okay. And then just in terms of LinkedIn, now you're a very good user of LinkedIn, I've noticed. And I even had, I think, Yaz well, who's said to me today that one of the things he was told when he came to Australia, if you're going to try and get a job, a grad job, you need to have your LinkedIn. And I often say to people, well, you may
Yes,
not like it, you may think of it as social media, but I tell you what, it makes a recruiter's job a lot easier. It's
you've
just
got
a
to do it.
must-have, isn't it? I mean, what are your tips and tricks in relation to LinkedIn from a career viewpoint?
I think you have to do LinkedIn. Um, I, I don't really think you've got a choice, particularly, if you're my age and older and you've been around longer. I can choose not to. I don't think it would be wise personally, but you could choose not to. If you're younger and you're potentially looking for a job, you have to have LinkedIn. And what you really want is to start LinkedIn now and stay on it. So you've built, the next 10 years. So in 10 years' time, someone's looking at you and it doesn't look like you've just conjured up a history in the last 5 minutes. I think
Mm,
LinkedIn is really important. But also think about if you want to use, so I use LinkedIn for my free articles for people who aren't, they're obviously not my clients. They can know certain parts of my thinking for free. I don't care. And they're dated, and I never go back and edit those articles. So they are set in stone at a certain date. So I can say to someone, well, I said that publicly, and that was the date. So go check it for yourself. So think about how you might use LinkedIn. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. You can just record your details. But what I did when I first started on LinkedIn, I looked around the circles of people I knew and who were the people who seemed to be switched on and smarter about those sorts of things, and who were the people who were a bit senior to me. And then I went and looked at their LinkedIn and look at what they wrote. And I actually have at various times employed people to write my LinkedIn profile for me because I know that's something I would be hopeless at.
mm,
So those sorts of things I think are very worthwhile thinking about.
mm. I totally agree. I think having a good photo and things like that. It's funny how we're prepared to spend money on tennis coaches, for example, but we don't spend money on things which might have very large payoffs.
Yes.
Like,
Can I also talk about something that might have a very large cost, and that is your social media generally? Okay,
mm,
so when I've gone to interview people, obviously I look at their social media, and sometimes I've had to warn some people quietly about things that I found on their social media that they didn't realise. There's a there's another side to social media that people need to be conscious of. Because if I or anyone is interviewing you, I can assure you we'll all be checking. You really need to be smart about photos that go up, the comments that go up. Some time ago, a long time ago now, I worked for a short time, I worked for a social media platform, giving them some strategy advice on how they could improve their platform. I left that platform for ethical reasons. And let me just say to you that if you are 84 years of age or less, if you are 16 years of age, I think 16 to 84, if you've never had a social media account, if you've done virtually nothing, but if I can find out who some of your friends are, so maybe there's photos of you on some of their social media accounts and I can recognize who you are, I can pretty well find out to about 99% accuracy. I can tell you how you vote. I can tell you if you've ever had an affair. I can tell you if you've ever stolen money. I can tell you if you have any addiction problem, being alcohol, drugs, gambling, whatever. I can tell you things about yourself that I should never be able to discern. And there are tools out there that would enable me to do that to you. I personally disagree with them, but I know people use them. So
mm,
I would suggest people really have to be a lot smarter than they are about how they use social media tools. And that
mm.
includes photos, for God's
I,
sake.
I think that's a really valid one, Paul. I know I've had, not personally for me, but I've been involved in an organisation where it's had some very serious implications for a very serious senior person. You know,
Ah,
it's a big
and
one.
it's a horrendous conversation to
Yeah,
have with people.
yeah,
And I've had it with staff that I had to have conversations that photos that were sent into the workplace because they were silly enough to put them up on social media. And then some of those allegations can have criminal ramifications, and then it leaves the organisation open to needing to go and get legal advice of, do I have to dob in one of my own staff members for something that has nothing to do with work, but I've seen a photo?
mm,
There's all sorts of implications. Um, People
mm.
should be a lot smarter, James.
Agreed. Now let's just circle back to a few questions. Jason's asked a great one. He said Australia's economy has benefited significantly from China's infrastructure boom. Given the recent slowdown in Chinese demand, geopolitical tensions, how do you see the future trajectory of the Australian economy?
Um, I'm just going to start with the obvious. I think the Australian economy is stupid. So I think we are a very non-value added economy, and history says we don't learn. So my unfortunate expectation is the pressures between us, China and us get along so well, then we don't, then we do, then we don't. I think those issues will continue. I think for the foreseeable future, I don't see that changing. We're useful to China in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, China can work to replace us. Look at the work with Brazil and Peru, for example, and their exports. Sure, they can do that. Australia, they can look to having other solutions, but I think that nexus between us probably suits us both in a lot of ways. My hope for Australia is that we would smarten up, but we're a very lazy country, in my view. And I think it has a lot to do with, was it David Bourne who made that famous quote about us being a lazy country or the lucky country? Sorry. And what he talked about was we were so blessed with natural riches that we're a country run by second-class managers, was his expression, and that's we don't have to improve. So my hope is that we do. So if you want to talk about silicon chips, look at what Australia is doing in quantum chips, because some of that is absolutely terrific work Australia is doing. That really is outstanding. So if we can do some of those more, I think that would be, so that's my hope for Australia. But, as they say, your history often foretells your future.
Mm.
So I would expect our tensions with China will just continue on and off as it suits both of us.
Mm. Jason's asked another one in relation to the superannuation industry, and he was saying about scrutiny of the industry super funds in light of recent cyber incidents. Do you foresee any regulatory headwinds for the super funds?
Regulatory headwinds, yes. So I think you've seen a hint of it recently when there's been some issues come out about their death benefits and not paying people out and not processing people. And anyone here has even tried to change your postal address with your super fund, in all likelihood, you have had terrible trouble getting them to even recognise when your email's changed or anything. That scrutiny will have to become harder. One, because the outsourced provider that most of them in Australia use is not a very good performer, in my opinion. I declared I was working with a competitor against them. So I actually was an advisor to IBM Australia. And we lost out to this solution provider, and we warned the super funds at the time, and they knew what they were heading into. It was the cheapest option. It is not good administratively, and some of those issues are starting to come out. You're starting to see it in death benefits. You've been seeing it for a time in people changing their details. There are other issues that have come out with one of the very large super funds who has not been able to process members now for, I think we're up to 9 weeks. Can't process. So that is starting to come out a bit more publicly. The other issue that might, a totally unrelated issue that might start coming out in super funds is as you go through these structural changes, if we've got investment teams that haven't been really dialed in or aren't really dialing into geopolitical risk and what that means, then you can see super funds getting caught out quite badly. They cost an awful lot of money every year that I think your average Australian has no idea how much the industry costs. If we as an industry start losing them slabs of money, we are going to come under a lot more scrutiny. So on either of those counts, the third count I would look at is how big super is as an asset for your average Australian household. So on any one of those counts, below all three that are known factors, I would suggest to you, yes, the industry will come under much more scrutiny in my view.
Um, Scott, I'll go to Scott's last one because it's a bit of a political one, and I know you don't mind giving a little bit of an opinion on politics, but what are your thoughts on the taxation of unrealised gains?
Um, I think let me step back before I answer that. I think you have to be aware that superannuation is concessionally taxed, and that is a privilege that is given to those of us who have super. And for those of us who have super more than $3 million, even better privilege. At a certain point, you have to say, as a society, that's not fair. Can I have 10 million concessionally taxed? I mean, at a certain point, you've just got to say, hold on, that's not fair. That's too much money. So there has to be a limit. I am very uncomfortable with the idea of taxing someone, however, on unrealised gains, because by definition, I have to pay tax on something I haven't realised the gain from. There's an obvious gap there. So there's a question of fairness from that as well, in my opinion.
Okay, to the last one, Paula. Larry Fink. That's the question about, I think Larry Fink made the comment about private markets that weren't accessible to everyday investors, ports, I think data centers,
Yes.
things like this. Um,
Yes.
what do you think? Do you think is what do you think?
I'm on
Anything?
record for what I think about this because I've already given my opinion on this too.
Mm,
I may as
um,
well tell you my same opinion. I think as a principle, it's excellent if mums and dads in Australia can have access to unusual investments that allow them to differentiate and potentially investments that allow them to outperform their normal investment expectations. However, very big however, history tells you when you start mingling mums and dads with institutional investors, we can all tell you who's going to lose. Every single time, mums and dads lose. So I think mums and dads, non-sophisticated investors, if you'll pardon my using the parlance, moving into certain investments, I'd love them to have access. Maybe it's through an investment club, maybe it's through the superannuation fund, but when it's them doing the investing for themselves, history tells you they get done like a dinner by the institutional investor, intentionally or not. They end up being the people who pay. So they pay potentially because they're not as well informed. They pay potentially because they pay disordinate amount of fees. They pay potentially because they're the ones left holding the bag. But one way or another, history tells you if you commingle them, it's not a smart idea. So I'd love them to have access through another channel. But I hate the idea of mums and dads effectively in the same pond because that doesn't end well in my view.
okay. Paula, I think you've been, okay. Well, Scott's just asked one last question. What should the CFA Institute do about this? Well, I guess we can't do too much
I can
direct.
answer that. Yes, we can. We already have, Scott. Thank you for asking. The Institute has already offered some counsel and some views, and we've done research, and we have research available internationally, and we do meet of our own free will, and they have very nicely reached out to us, and we have done our best to answer their question, and we've given them a selection of people from different backgrounds who have tried to help. Hopefully have.
The Now, look, when we thought about this session, it basically came out of our last monthly drinks. So normally we meet at the Treasury Hotel on Collins once a month, and Scott actually is one of the key organisers of that. I thought a lot of people were keen to talk macro themes and things. So
Yeah, okay.
we this was one of the reasons we sought you out, Paula, for your and
Well, thank
generously
you.
gave your time today.
Happy to, James. It's really been a lovely conversation, so I hope it's been helpful.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paula. Now, what was your favourite wine again, Paula? We'll send you a bottle of our branded Melbourne Investing Club wine.
Okay,
Tell me
that
which
would
one
be
it is.
lovely. A Shiraz would be lovely, James, if you can, and if you can't, don't worry.
No,
If you
no.
can't, next time you're all having a drink, buy yourself a bottle of Shiraz and share it around everyone. That might be a better use. How about that?
Oh, we'll do both. We'll do both. Okay,
Okay,
right. Thanks
cool.
so much for your time, Paula. And
You're
for
very
everyone
welcome.
else, we're next Thursday actually. We've got our drinkers event, so we'll do the Shiraz then. But
Well,
sincere
have a
thanks to
Shiraz for
Paula.
me next Thursday, and I hope that was helpful. And I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. It was